Good morning. Good morning. I am Kelly Marshall, the Senior Vice President of Schools here with the Mind Trust, and I'm really excited about what we are about to bring to you today. Just to give you a heads up, we at the Mind Trust are really looking forward to continuing the support that we have been for our schools, but we're also wanting to make sure that we are being as equitable as possible and being as strategic as possible with supporting schools across a broad spectrum. We know the hard work that each of you are doing in your schools, and we are looking forward to having an amazing school year with you again this year. Today, the goal is to not just provide you with an opportunity to see the resources that we have been bringing to the table and maybe introduce you to some new partners, but also to provide you with some information that we hope will be helpful as you navigate through this new ESSER funding that you have coming your way. Leaders and school leaders that are out there live, we know that these times that you are now engaging in are some that are the most challenging. We know the work that you've put into making sure that your students are receiving the best possible academic environment that you can provide, and we just want to make sure that we are a resource to you. There are a couple things that you have already, many of you have already experienced this year in terms of the changes that we're trying to make with the schools team in particular. And we appreciate those of you that just submitted your funding request for that first round of investments, and you are now receiving the documentation and as to what we'll be able to move forward with. That's just one aspect of the changes that are to come. You'll notice that as we continue to work with you, we plan to be more visible on your campuses. Of course, not being in any way intrusive, but we want to make sure that we have the full context of what you're engaging in with students and what our supports or how our supports are contributing to the success of your schools. So I won't take long. I just want to make sure that you know all the members of the school team. Once again, I am Kelly Marshall, Senior Vice President of Schools. Sarah Marshall will continue to lead our talent division as our Senior Director of Talent. Paula Glover is now our Director of Recruitment and Project Management. Sonia Peters will still remain our Senior Director of Incubation, and we are welcoming a new staff member, Bernadette Monk, who is our Manager of School Support and Incubation. Throughout the year, I'm sure you'll be able to engage with many of us. And without further ado, let's get the ball rolling. We're excited to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Everybody hear me okay? So I guess I'm just used to asking that all the time. So Brian Anderson, Director of Finance with the Center for Innovative Education Solutions. I'm here with my partner in crime, Kim Ballin, who many of you know as well. Kim will have a chance to introduce herself and kind of get us started on our presentation, the information that matters, actually. But I'll give a quick overview of who we are for those of us who may not know us. CIES is almost 3 years old now. So I like saying that because I've been doing the same kind of work for 26 years now. So it's been a long time, but it's nice in this format, with a nonprofit like CIS and providing these services specifically in Indiana. The fact that we're 3 years old now feels pretty good, actually. Kim and I were the original two business services team members for CIES, and we've grown now to added 3 more and another part-time contractor. So we've grown a bit, which is nice. We serve, depending on how you count clients, a network of 2 schools is 1 client, but if you count the schools, we're actually providing ongoing service to 22 clients right now. And then there are several other schools that we touch through other forms of service, through facilities work, finance work. There's a new special ed co-op that many of you will start hearing about, Sherry Anderson. You might get to know that name, no relation, but she's going to be developing an opportunity for many of the schools who have requested, it's been based on feedback, a need for a special ed co-op. So you'll be getting to know her and kind of the services that she's going to be offering with a separate nonprofit, but she's working through us with CIES right now. Like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. The business services side of the team, the services we provide, is consulting type services where our focus is to get schools to take control and manage their day-to-day business functions. And then we provide financial oversight, reporting, budgeting, helping set up systems, working with the schools to allow the schools to manage their own information, and provide the important financial information that schools need to both their boards and regulatory bodies and all those types of things. A big part of that, what has taken on a life of its own, really, is this ESSER funding. And we will get into that in detail in a minute, but just a quick overview is, I think most of you already know, there have been 3 rounds of federal funding that have come out of the COVID pandemic and have been targeted for public schools, which we are taking part in. The first round was called CARES funding. It was the CARES Act, and there was funding that came to all the schools. Everyone thought, wow, this is great. We've got all these new funds. Then there was a second round, and the name switched to ESSER, so it's ESSER 2. That second round of funding, everyone just couldn't believe how much more money came in. And then there was ESSER 3 that came in recently, and the deadlines have already been set for, getting your budget into the state and that kind of thing. But that was even more funding. So there's been a lot of money. There's a lot of questions about what we can use it for, and there's a lot of questions and really important discussion going on within our schools, within many other schools we've talked to, about strategically how do we best use this one-time source of funding that we have the next 3 years to use, really. So we'll get into those kinds of details. What that has done to our work is it's really increased workload for Kim specifically and another team member that we have in getting up to speed on compliance issues and on the grants management piece of this. Everyone's been learning about this at the same time. The DOE has been learning from the federal government what they need. Then they're passing that along to us on the ground. And then we're learning so this is a fluid situation. And there's a lot of work, a lot of compliance involved, but it's great because there are a lot of dollars to help schools. So longer than I wanted to go, but that's an overview. That's who I am. That's who CIES is. I will hand it over to Kim to introduce herself, and then she'll get us started on her presentation.
Good morning, everybody. So yes, Brian, thank you so much for the introduction, and we want to welcome everybody today. Thank you for taking the time out to join us. We know everybody's super busy wrapping up your school year and already heading into the next, so we appreciate your time today. As Brian said, we work a lot with schools with finance, and specifically as well, I work with schools on grant management. And so Brian is right. We will go into the details of ESSER in just a moment, but just wanted to make sure that we just talked a little bit about what we do here at CIES and how we support schools. I feel like the services that we are able to provide schools are truly beneficial. It helps schools to be able to focus on the things that are most important, which are your students and your staff. So we really pride ourselves in kind of allowing, taking on some of these, finance and grant type items so that you can truly put your focus and capacity into the school itself and the vision, the mission of the school, the overall planning. And so, a lot of my role in what I do is grant management. And so my role has kind of morphed into that as we've kind of listened to what the schools need. Brian handles more of the financial oversight, the board reporting, the year-end reports that are due, the reports that are due throughout the year to the DOE and other organizations. But we definitely love working together. We've worked together for 3 years now and just really enjoy what we do. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Jason. All right, so just a little bit about what we're going to talk through today. We are going to do just a very quick overview on ESSER, just talk a little bit about some resources that are there for you if you need them. I believe this slide deck will be sent out, so there are links within the slide deck that can help throughout if you need them. We will talk a little bit about ESSER compliance, maybe some things that are new, especially with ESSER 3. So we're going to show some examples of that compliance and what you'll need to do as a school to make sure you're staying compliant. We will talk a little bit about grant management. If you are a school who does not have any back office support, this particular section of our presentation today is just going to show you visually ways that you can possibly manage your grants visually, just to give you an idea of how we help our schools. And then we'll talk a little bit about amendments. And that piece is really more of an FYI as well, and just some things to kind of think through if you are, if you've already submitted your budget and possibly needing revisions already. And then Brian will talk through the financial piece. So he's going to talk through planning. He's going to talk through budgeting. We know that you've already, had to submit budgets for these ESSER dollars. So if you've already submitted your budget and to the DOE, this is more of a presentation to really help you understand if you have submitted it for a particular purpose. This might give you another idea or another direction you could possibly take if that's something you're interested in. And then finally, we'll end with a Q&A where you can ask questions. And feel free to also use the chat box today to drop any questions that you have along the way. This is for you. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop those questions in throughout the presentation. All right, Jason, I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we have linked in here a few things. So this specifically is ESSER 2 and 3 resources. As Brian said, the first round of CARES, you've probably already hopefully used that money and drawn that money down. It was a smaller allocation. So today we're mostly going to focus on ESSER 2 and 3 resources. So if you don't need to click the link, Jason, but if the once the slide deck is sent out, you can go ahead and click that link. That will take you to the allocations. Not only can you see your allocation, but you can also see allocations for other schools if you're interested in that. You can look at FAQ. I will say the DOE has done a really great job of putting together the resources for both of these grants. It really clearly lays out high-level overviews on this particular resource page. The FAQ is extremely helpful when it comes to specific details around funding and what you need to be spending what you can spend your money on or can't spend your money on, the deadlines, the spend by deadlines, and that type of thing. So definitely take a look at that page if you haven't already. It also gives a very clear budget example. The budget example is helpful when you are planning for this funding and when you're entering your budgets in the Title I App Center. So if you're kind of not sure which category a specific position might go, or a professional service that you're budgeting in, like transportation, it will clearly show you which budget category to use. As you have, I'm sure, already seen the Title I App Center, the budget categories and expenditure accounts, they are a lot different than the Title I App Center typically is. So, you know, there's a lot more categories, and sometimes it's just a trial and error of like which ones to use for each specific budget line, but that budget example tool can definitely be helpful as a guide. And then it also gives some of the compliance information that I'm going to talk through today as well. I want to point out, this is, you know, mark your calendars. These dates are crucial, and they're really important to think through when it comes to planning for these grants as well. So for CARES 1, you actually still have a whole nother year to use that funding if you haven't already. So the first ESSER CARES round period of eligibility for your expenses are 3/13/20. So we're going back to the date that the pandemic started, and we're going through 9/30/2022. ESSER 2 availability period is 3/13/20. Again, you can technically go back to expenses starting March 13th, 2020. We're going to talk a little bit about that a little later and how that might affect things for you in reporting. But you can go through 9/30/2023. So as you're thinking about this funding and planning for this funding, it's really nice that you have some time. This money does not need to be spent right away. You have time to plan through this money, you know, by school year, by fiscal year. And so lastly, ESSER 3, which the budgets that were just due for that on June 25th, that period is again 3/13/20 to 9/30/2024. And we will talk through some of that availability period and how that might affect your audits and your fiscal year end closeout. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about ESSER compliance. Compliance, you know, this is never the topic that's super fun to talk about. My hope is that with this portion of the presentation today, you're going to leave with maybe some insight and a helpful guide on the specific compliance that's needed needed sooner than later when it comes to some of the new compliance items for ESSER. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk through, before we dive into ESSER 3 and some of the new changes, we are going to talk through an email that you may have gotten this past week from the IDOE. In January, all schools were required to submit any expenses that they had incurred from 3/13/20 through 2020 for CARES 1. This was a very quick turnaround. Many of you know Cole requested that we submit this quickly. And so if you received an email this week regarding this data report, the DOE is basically saying that the way they collected the data and how they understood to collect the data and how the federal government wanted that data from each state, it's different than what they had originally understood. And so with that, they're asking schools to go back to that report and to break out how that data is broken down by budget category. So in the beginning, I believe they had us submit, one lump sum of expenses for overall CARES 1 for that period of time of 3/13/20 to 9/30/20. But now they're asking that we break it down another level and we take it and break it down by students that are disadvantaged. I believe they're asking us to also break it down by mental health services. So they're just basically asking you to break it down by budget category. So if you received that report last week and you do have any other questions or clarification on that, please definitely let us know. Brian?
And Kim, I'll just add to that real quickly too, for those of you, if you did receive one of those emails, it's important to know this. So how Kim explained it is exactly what it is. What the email says is something a little different. So you may take it as if you did something wrong. The email says there was an error in your data submission. You must correct this error by, and it gives you like 5 days. So it sounds very much like it was your fault. This wasn't. This was something, as Kim described, that DOE learned differently from the federal government. So don't take that email personally. It's the wording's interesting. So it wasn't anything you did wrong.
Yes, absolutely. It can definitely feel like that sometimes when we get those emails from the DOE, but this one is definitely a correction that I believe that's needed on their end to report it in a different way than was originally thought. So thank you, Brian. We are going to move on then to ESSER compliance, and I'm really focusing, sorry, Jason, can you go back one slide? I'm really focusing on ESSER 3 because really ESSER 3 is where the changes, we really start to see the changes, the bigger changes happen when it comes to compliance and what schools are required to do. With ESSER 2, we didn't really have a lot of that compliance. As you all know, ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, all of the grants are extremely flexible. But with ESSER 3, they decided to have a little bit more regulations and requirements in terms of what the funding had to be spent on. So for ESSER 3, there is a required 20% learning loss set aside. And as you know, in the Title I App Center, they've also distinguished those budgets separately. So if you go to the Title I App Center and you see the totals for those specific budgets, you can actually change, the system will automatically auto-populate the 20% learning loss set aside, but you can actually change that amount. So if you, in terms of if you wanted to increase it, if you decide or if you figure out that 30% of your budget for ESSER 3 is learning loss, then you can make that adjustment in the Title I App Center accordingly. The other big piece to this is that with ESSER 3, you have the 20% learning loss set aside is the only amount that you needed to budget for by June 25th. So that is something that may or may not have been very clear for all of the schools. But after I spoke with Cole, I feel like that really helped ease a lot of stress around planning for this funding, because as Brian mentioned, this amount was higher than any of the other two prior grants. So if you only budgeted that 20% learning loss by June 25th, you still have time to make sure that you're really thinking through how you want to use this money, and you can still, plan for that going forward. I don't believe they have set a deadline for the remaining 80%. So you have a little bit of time. They might have set that deadline, but as of now, you still have a little time to plan for the remaining 80%. The other thing is that ESSER 3 is going to have a maintenance of equity required at the LEA level. They're still waiting on additional guidance from the U.S. Department of Ed on that, so it's nothing for you to really worry about right now. But I have linked an article in the slide deck for the maintenance of equity if you want to read up on that a little bit more. Next slide. Okay, so one of the big takeaways that I'm hoping is helpful for everybody today is your new requirement for your COVID action plan. And so on April 22nd, the U.S. Department of Ed decided that they are going to require schools to have an return to in-person instruction plan required for each LEA. So some of the key points to this is that it must be developed by your LEA. You must seek public comment. So you can do that a few different ways, and however your school communicates with your students, families, and your community, there's a few ideas that I can throw out there. You can use a Google type survey. You can use like a Google form. There's SurveyMonkey. There's so many different platforms of how you can gather this information. I think the Google form is probably one of the simplest. But again, you must seek that public comment before developing your plan. So later on in a couple slides, I'm going to show you an email way, a way you can email that to your families if that's helpful. And then this is also really crucial. So you must post it on your public website within 30 days of receiving your ESSER 3 funds. So before, if you request reimbursement, that plan must be on your school website within 30 days of receiving your funds. If it were me and I were guiding my schools as to what to do, I would recommend that be on your website 30 days prior to requesting your first reimbursement. That way, it's there and it's not something we have to try to scramble and worry about getting on your website. For all of our schools, I will require that to be done before we help with reimbursements on ESSER 3. Next slide. Okay, so some of the things that your COVID action plan must include, and I'm actually going to go to this slide. It's a little tough to see on my screen here. So I'm going to go to, there we go. Some things that your plan must include is universal and correct wearing of masks. So you must address all of these items. Modifying your facilities to allow for social distancing, hand washing and respiratory etiquette, cleaning and maintaining healthy facilities, including improving ventilation, contract tracing in combination with isolation and quarantine in collaboration with the state, local, territorial, and tribal health departments. Diagnostic and screening testing, efforts to provide vaccinations to school communities, appropriate accommodations for children with disabilities with respect to health and safety policies, coordination with state and local health officials. So these are kind of your non-negotiable items that you must address in your COVID action plan. You can also seek public comment when you're requesting that from your community regarding these items as well, but they must be included in your plan. Next slide. Okay, and then these are just some kind of logistics around the plan itself. It must be updated no less than every 6 months. So you kind of have to reevaluate each 6-month period to determine if anything in your plan has changed or needs to be revised. You must include public input when the revisions are necessary. So if you do find that there is something that you need to change within your plan, again, you must include public input on that. If an LEA already has a plan in place, so if this is something you've already done, but it doesn't meet the new requirements that I just discussed, then you must revise your plan within 6 months of creating and posting it on your website. Your plan must be in a clear and uniform format. It must be available to all. And that also means that if there's, translations that are required, then you must be able to provide those for your families and your students. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is just a sample email that I took from a local district that sent out their public request for comment. And so it's just a really simply laid out email, just talks a little bit about, making your families aware that there is, due to the American Rescue Act, that the school is responsible to make sure that they are requesting that public comment from them. It notes that the items that you must do as a school, so that you must have your COVID plan in place in order for students to return to in-person learning. You must gather public comment, and you must post the plan on your district website within 30 days of receiving the funds. So all the things I just talked about. it kind of helps your families understand why you're sending this request out. And then this particular school used a Google form, so they linked that very easily in the email itself. And then also they noted that the survey is also on their website. So just a very simple, basic email. This is just a format in case it's helpful for you. Next slide. All right, and Jason, if you don't mind, I have received permission from this particular school that we work with. They are on the ball and have already developed their COVID action plan. So I'm going to go ahead and have Jason bring that up. The school that we work with that agreed to this is Invent Learning Hub. They are a wonderful school to work with. And Jason, I think it's it's the Google Doc link. Yep, there we go. You can make that a little bit bigger. What I really liked about this plan was that it was simple. It was just simple, easy to follow. So this particular school talked a little bit about, their school day, what their school day would look like. They talked about practicing prevention, and then just listed out a few bullet points on how they would make sure that they would do that within the school. They talked about transportation, making sure it's very clear for families, students, staff to understand, what changes they are implementing, or what things maybe are a little bit different with transportation for their students. Scroll down just a little bit. So entering the school building, serving meals. Again, this is just to give you an idea of how you can possibly lay out your plan if you haven't already. The transitioning in the hallways. So she talks a little bit about, Alicia Osler, the head of school, talks a little bit about the transitions, how that's going to work not only with students, but with staff as well. Scroll down a little bit more. This is just a 4-page document, so it doesn't need to be anything extremely elaborate. Conducting large group gatherings. So if you have an event or a community event at your school, or something with your students and families, you want to talk a little bit about how you're going to make sure that you go about that in the proper way. How the school is going to support teaching and learning, maybe things that you're going to do differently with instruction or spacing of your desks, and all of that. Okay, one more page, I believe. Masks and contact tracing. And then I believe she also talks a little bit about vaccinations. Yeah, vaccinations, communication, practicing proper protection for any vulnerable populations. And then she talks about the terms. So again, this document is really to help give you an idea of how your plan could possibly look, or just ways you can make sure to lay out the information. If you also want to go to the second plan, Jason, this is one that I pulled from the MSD of Martinsville. So I wanted to show you another type of way that you could possibly talk through your plan. This school's district decided to use color coding. And so that's how they kind of broke out their plan in, color codes and days of the week. They also have just, broken it out into different student subcategories. So if you're wanting something, like this that has a more of a visual, pleasing to the eye, so to speak, of color coding and things of that nature, then here's a plan that you could possibly reference as well. And let's go back to the slide deck. Thanks, Jason. All right, I am almost done, and we're gonna let Brian take the stage. Before I do, I wanted to talk a little bit about how you're going to manage your funds. So with grant management, you want to make sure that you, your school, your team, that you have a solid tracking system in place, not just for ESSER, but for all of your grants. And so, we're definitely not perfect with this. We're still learning, we're still growing and finding more efficient ways to track grants. But I have found that having a separate internal grant tracker for our schools is extremely helpful when it comes to, what you've spent for each particular budget item, what you've reimbursed, and making sure that you understand what's on your budget, right? There's so many different grants that schools are responsible for. So I'm going to show you a way that might be helpful for you to internally track your grant budgets and your spending. You want to ensure that you have all documentation on file for your expenses. If you are a school that, loves paper, there's nothing wrong with making sure that you have all of your receipts, invoices, and expenses documented, in a binder or in a folder, whatever is more comfortable for you and your school. I say in the early stages of your school, if you are young, having binders by grant is really helpful because it helps keep your grants separate by fiscal year. And it also helps if there's any transitions that happen in staff, right? Like you don't necessarily want all of your documents electronically if they're going to be difficult for you to locate in an audit. So that's kind of why I always recommend schools start off with some type of binder or paper way of tracking your expenses. That way you have them, you know that they're easy to grab and you can pull them. We also save all of our documentation electronically. But again, for staffing purposes, I feel like it's just really helpful to have that paper trail. You also want to make sure that you're tracking each of your ESSER budgets in separate tabs or separately. You don't want to necessarily have them in two different Excel documents. I'm going to show you a way that, I combine them. Because with ESSER 2 and 3 especially, some of the expenses might overlap or they might, be the same from year to year if you're planning by fiscal year. So you want to make sure that you can easily pull up your ESSER 2 and your ESSER 3 budgets side by side so that you can see, okay, what did I have in expenses for ESSER 2 and how does that differ from ESSER 3? Or it just can help you easily understand too where you're at with spending if you have them set up that way in your tracker. My recommendation as well is to save all of your emails. The ESSER grants, they have from the DOE, you receive your award letter in an email format. It is not in an attachment to an email. They send you just an email stating that your grant has been awarded. So I am currently saving all of those award letters for our schools, those emails. The other thing that you can do is save your applications. You can download those through the Title I App Center and it downloads in a PDF document. You will need that for your audits. So any applications that you submitted last fiscal year, your audits coming up, you're going to need those. So go on the Title I App Center, get those applications ahead of time so you don't have to do it during your audit. And then I like to save any documentation I receive from the DOE. So if there's anything that specifically a question that was asked, I save that just to make sure I can go back and reference it. And then the last thing that I want to point out before we go to our grant tracker visual is that I want to point out that it will be easier for your school, for your staff, if you focus on trying to draw down one grant at a time, one ESSER grant at a time. So, obviously you all can decide how you want to use your funds, how you want to plan, but it might be easier for you if you try to just focus on one at a time. Jason, go ahead and bring up the Google Sheet. And I just wanted to show schools how we currently track for our schools internally. I haven't found the magic software for grant tracking. We've looked at a few different grant softwares, and I just haven't found anything that I like enough that details it enough for me and for our team to be able to easily track grants. So this is just a tracker that I created something that is very helpful for us that we use. I share this with the school team. So anybody that's involved in helping with tracking expenses by grant, that way they can see exactly what each grant budget has, how much we have allocated per line item. As you know, the Title I App Center, it makes you group your amounts by budget category. That's not helpful because then you don't know how much you allocated for each specific line item. And so I really like to make sure that it's detailed how much I have budgeted for each specific thing. And that includes, salaries, benefits, professional services, supplies. And then what I like to do when I do the reimbursements is I like to put the total amount for each budget line in the reimbursement 1 category. It then draws that down in the red column, as you can see the amount remaining. So it helps the school, it helps our team know, okay, they have X amount remaining to draw down for this particular position. And it gives us a clear stopping point when we know we've drawn down that entire salary amount. I also, on the left-hand side of this document, I like to also show the budget categories from the DOE that I use. So when I'm submitting a reimbursement, I like to obviously then group those budget category totals together. That is very helpful because when we ever need to look back at a reimbursement form to try to figure out what it is that we submitted, I can go back and see, okay, I submitted, $100,000 in this budget category, and this is how it was broken down. Some schools, I like to color code those budget categories visually, so it's just easy for me to see exactly what made up that particular budget category total. But at the bottom, just really quickly, I've also separated them out by grant. And so this helps a lot when we're trying to figure out, how much do we have left in this grant to spend for this fiscal year and, this grant over here. It kind of helps tie them all out. I keep a separate grant tracker by fiscal year. That way we know, especially with the grant periods going into the new fiscal year, it really helps us be able to differentiate, which title funding we're drawing down, right? We know that Title I is going to go through 9/30 of 2021, but we also know that we got new title funding that will start July 1st of this year. So we always have that overlap. And so in order to, delineate and differentiate those grant years, I really like to make sure that I'm having a new separate tracker for each fiscal year. It helps so much with the audits. We know that the auditors we work with like to see it broken down this way as well. So again, this is just a visual for you. If you are interested in talking with us more about grant management services, let us know, and we're happy to do that. Jason, you can go ahead and go back. I believe I have just one more slide before I hand it over to Brian. I wanted just to quickly talk through amendments. So again, you can technically go back to 313.20 for eligible expenses. So if you decide that you wanted to change what you're spending your ESSER dollars on, you can do that. You can go back. Just know that if you're going back to 313.20, you're going back into a fiscal year that's already been audited. So as we know with compliance and state reporting, that's not always the best thing to do. But if it's something, that you need to do, with our schools, we have year-end closeout coming. So any expenses that happen from 7/1 through 6/30, we're going to be focusing on those. We decided not to go back to 313 past, the period that we had for helping our schools with CARES 1 and ESSER 2. But, if you need to go back, we have a short window with Form 9 reporting and all of that coming up to be able to do that. But just know that this is really the only grant that you can do this. where your amendments don't necessarily need to match your spend dates. So if you add something new to your budget, usually you can only purchase that item from that date of the amendment submitted going forward. Whereas this grant, that rule doesn't apply. And so that is really helpful, especially if you're trying to make sure that you are trying to cover the costs that you've had over this past year for COVID and pandemic related items. We are not, for the sake of time, going to hop into the Title I App Center. I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and he's just going to talk through some of the financial planning that schools can be thinking about.
All right, great. Thanks, Kim. Very helpful, very detailed. And this is, I'm going to go through the financial planning part very quickly. We'll be done on time, so don't worry. And it's interesting because this part of the conversation about kind of how you go into the decision making about how you best use those funds, this can be done like presentation wise. This can be done in like a 5 to 10 minute summary, like this will be, or the next stage is almost like a 2 to 3 different day, multi-hour planning session. So there's the in between. It's tough to, you get into details, and it's tough to know which details to go further on and which details not to. So this will be very summary in the next few minutes, and then leave it open for questions. But I want to hit on a couple of key points for just how to think about this funding. I think one of the things is, and I'm gonna make one comment about what Kim just said about some of the compliance issues and some of the things that charter schools face. Again, charter schools in Indiana face this, nowhere else, and school corporations in Indiana don't face this. But with the ability to go back and make budget amendments back to March of 2020, that's what matters. So if you have expenses that qualify and you want to use your ESSER funding for that are a prior fiscal year, do that. You're allowed to do that. The issue that comes up is that you've already had accrual-based audited financial statements submitted. So what that means is those statements will no longer be accurate. In the real world, that's a big issue to restate financial statements or to make prior year adjustments. But that is a function of our financial oversight system in Indiana with charter schools. That's inevitable because of the difference between cash and accrual-based accounting. I won't get into those details, but don't worry about that so much. Let others deal with the details, but know that if you can go back and you have expenses that qualify and you want to use those, do those, and then let others figure out the details and what that means for, prior audited financial statements, because it is allowable. So, and that's kind of the overview for financial planning, how to use the money, I think is very important. Think smartly first. Think about what's going to help you as a school, what's going to better serve your students, what's going to better help you build financial stability. Think about that first. Compliance always matters. It always matters. But compliance is the secondary piece of this. The most important thing is use the money wisely. So to get into that, again, very, very briefly, just 3 quick slides. And the way I tend to do this is to talk about what you need to know first, what you can spend the money on, and then kind of a few things to think about before deciding how to spend the money. So the first thing you need to know is the key characteristics of your school. Each school is different. So each school is going to have a different reason and a different best use of these funds. So what are the key characteristics you really need to focus on? Stage of school development. So are you at full growth? Are you a mature school that's been around 5-6 years? Are you in your second charter? Are you a second year school that is a slow growth school that is adding grades and adding students each year? Understanding who you are and remaining true to where your financial goals are, where your school growth development is important. That provides an important context for the types of decisions and the types of ways that you use the money. The money can be used in a very flexible way. So use it wisely to best serve your school. Second thing is, and this is important to know, are you an innovation partner or not, an IPS innovation partner? And we work with innovation schools that are in LEA innovation for IPS that are non-charter schools. In their case, it's completely different. So that's something that we won't even talk about here. But charter schools that also have an innovation partner agreement with IPS, the nature of that agreement, what that brings, and we'll get to point 3 here in a second, in terms of facility and transportation and custodial services and a lot of tech services and things you opt into, opt out of, what your relationship with IPS is, those types of things, that it's important to take that into consideration. It's a consideration to understand the best use of your funds. Number 3, again, this is a big one. This is for all charter schools everywhere, but facility status is such a huge, it's the difference between being a charter school and a traditional public school. So your facility status matters. And you could be an innovation partner in an IPS building. You could be an innovation partner in your own facility. You could be in your own temporary facility and still looking for a permanent facility because you're going to grow out of your current facility. Those types of things, and understanding where you are facility-wise, what your financial stability and what your financial planning ability is with your facility situation is really, really important. And then 4th, this is the other thing. I mean, you're spending almost all of your funds. You're spending 85, 90% of your money on people and buildings. That's where you spend it. So understanding your staffing compensation model, what you want your ultimate org chart to look like, what you want your compensation to look like, how you want your staffing to be, understanding where you are in that process and what you want it to be, the gap from where you are to where you want it to be, kind of do some analysis on that. So if you can identify those 4 things, that can really lead you then to the next slide to start thinking about, okay, what types of things can we spend the money on? So this is just a bullet point. There's many other things too, but what are the types of things? This is what's great about the ESSER funding actually, is you can use it. Thinking about the restrictions, there's a restriction on 20% of ESSER 3. So that's 20% of that 3 rounds of funding, which is a very small overall restricted amount. And even within that restricted amount, there's a lot of different ways to use it. So these types of things, these are the things that we're seeing schools use the most, or things they're choosing to spend their money on the most. New staff positions, that's a dangerous one, but that works well. This is why your characteristics matter. New staff positions, if you're a young school and growing in to a larger school, you can hire new staff positions ahead of when you intended to. And then you can grow into those and replace this one-time source of revenue with ongoing revenue to continue those positions. Temp positions, again, it's a warning sign. There's a lot of people are doing that, and there's good reasons to do that, to deal with learning loss. But temp positions, it's really pretty much important to know if it's a grant-funded position and the grant goes away, that staff understands that you're clear about what is a temporary position. Staff salary adjustments, I'm just going to talk faster just because of the time now. So facility improvements, again, COVID related, but things for like HVAC, airflow, that can help with social distancing, things like that. So facility improvements, curriculum, summer programming, before and after school programming, the operational compliance costs. It's important to know that you can actually use ESSER fundings to help with this increased compliance. So there are some of your audit costs that can use some of the funds for. Other contracted services, other student supports, again, for serving students with special needs, serving social emotional needs, dealing with learning loss, those types of things. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can use the money, different types of things. So if we go to the last slide, and this is the slide that really, this takes a long time. This is something that I think everyone needs to really spend a lot of good, deep time thinking about. Always happy to help and talk with people, talk things through, but talk with your leadership teams, your board, make sure you're all on the same page. How do you actually get the most out of your ESSER dollars? There's a few things. Recognize it is a one-time funding source. That obviously, one-time funding source. So lots and lots of money coming in to help. However, it's not going to be coming in 3 years from now. So make sure this is when you need to really update your 5-year plan, because you really need to understand the expenditure decisions you're making now. Are you going to be able to sustain those, replace those, or not have those in an ongoing state? Number 2, understand that you have time, and that's related to that. It's really important. You will get a lot of communication, and DOE is great. I mean, but you'll get a lot of communication that is very regulatory in nature and very deadline oriented. you have to meet deadlines, but you can submit a budget and then amend the budget. You have to realize that you have until 2022 to spend even the first round, 2023 to spend the second round, and 2024 to spend the third round. So you have time to lay this out and use it wisely. And then the third piece is when you tie these things together, there will be different strategies for different school characteristics. I'd love to talk through some of those, but I'm happy to stop now so there's at least a minute here for Q&A. And I'd be happy to talk further, but I'm also, it's hard. Can't like ask for a show of hands in the audience or anything if you want to go over, if we want to be done. So happy to be done, happy to answer questions, happy to continue talking through some of the strategies, some of the more detailed strategies, but however we want to move forward is fine with me. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you, and I hope what we provided today was useful. Hopefully we'll get a chance to maybe meet at the booth later this morning if we haven't met already, and feel free to contact us anytime if you need anything.